Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm so excited about the guest that we have on our LinkedIn Live today, Anita Leddink, and I'll talk about Anita in just a second. So for all of you who are just joining, who maybe don't know what we're talking about today, we're talking about the EU Directive. So the EU Directive is something that's looming and really is going to change everything about how companies prove they're paying employees fairly. And it's not just for companies that are based in the EU, but also for any company with a global footprint. So that's the topic of the day. We'll be on the LinkedIn Live for about 30 minutes. And I'm just absolutely thrilled to have our guest, Anita, with me today. So Anita is a partner at SMC, Strategic Management Center. And if you follow her on LinkedIn, which I highly recommend, 10 out of 10, you will hear her talking about all sorts of topics that are centered on the future of work. She's really been a leading authority on this, and including topics like pay, HR transformation, outsourcing, and other things. She's worked with some of the largest global organizations to reimagine the way that work gets done. And one of the things that you talk about, Anita, that I love so much, and have coined the phrase, is just really helping companies future-proof their business. And I think the topic today is right in the realm of that, in that companies really need to understand that if they're thinking this thing isn't going to be kicking in for 3 years, they've got another thing coming. So we're going to address that today, but just really appreciate all of your content and expertise. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for inviting me, Maria. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Of course. I'm Maria Colacurcio. I'm the CEO of Syndio. So we are a workplace equity platform, and we serve the Fortune 2000, helping them with software to analyze and resolve pay and opportunity gaps that could be due to something like gender, race, or ethnicity. So that is why we're here today hosting this session. Many of our customers are figuring out how to address the EU directive. And so we're bringing them expertise like that from Anita to sort of think through and future-proof and see around corners. So with that, we have 30 minutes, so I want to make sure the audience gets plenty of time to hear from you. So let's dive right in. So question one, at Syndio, we talk a lot with our customers about the importance of addressing pay equity in an ongoing way versus kind of a backward-looking one and done audit, because companies are constantly having employees entering, leaving, moving laterally, moving up, getting promoted. So pay disparities can really crop up at any time. So I'm curious, as just a starter question, what strategies and best practices would you recommend for organizations to ensure that they're continually making progress toward compliance over the next few years in light of what's coming?
Yeah, so maybe quickly, what exactly is coming? By 2027, all companies in the EU with more than 100 employees will have to mandatory report on the gender pay gap in their company. And that means that you need to make sure that you understand who gets paid, but not only who gets paid what. And one of the things that I would recommend is figure out what your baseline is fairly quickly and don't limit it to gender, because we are talking about pay equity, we are talking about workplace equity. And even though the EU has decided that this reporting needs to be focused on gender, you and I both know that there are lots of different ways that people are not being paid fairly. That can also be based on education. It can be based on tenure. It can be based on ethnicity, cultural background. So there's really a lot of characteristics that you need to take into account when you are thinking about pay transparency. So the first thing is, how do you measure up currently? Because if you do not know where to start, then it's going to be really impossible. So there's two things I think that you need to look at first. So what are your jobs and how do you grade them? And I'm not talking about very detailed job profiles. I'm talking about a high-level investigation around your job grades and see if that has any influence in the way that you pay people differently, and focus then maybe first on gender, but take the other aspects into account as well. And then secondly, think through your compensation strategy, because what I have found is that many companies do not have a compensation strategy. So if you don't have that, if you don't know how you pay people and what goes into a compensation strategy, then I'm going to assume you very likely find out that you do have a pay gap on any of the aspects that we mentioned. So when you are thinking about what to do next, do a quick analysis first to understand where you are, and don't let yourself be distracted by you don't know all the details, because that doesn't matter at this point in time.
So I love that. I love the notion that if you don't think you have a compensation philosophy, you actually do. And it's very likely compensation by negotiation or because of
Mm-hmm.
negotiation. I mean, it's something that is probably unintentional, but don't think just because you don't have an intentional policy or set of practices that you don't have one. You have one. It's just probably not the one that you want.
Yeah.
So Anita, in light of that, let's pretend we're a big multinational company. These are the types of companies that you're helping and strategizing with every single day. And so now they're looking at the EU directive. They're looking at this 3-year time frame. They're thinking, I've got 3 years. There's sort of two components that you mentioned up front, which I really appreciate, because this isn't just about gender. We're talking about race. We're talking about in Europe, ethnicity. We're talking about data collection, some different things that can be very tricky and difficult. So why should companies be thinking about this now? I mean, and then we'll kind of get
Mm-hmm.
into question two, which aligns with this. But if someone's thinking, if I'm a big multinational, what should they be thinking about right now in light of this sort of 3-year time frame?
So data is everything. And typically, large companies have more than one HR system. There's some research that they typically have 70 systems to handle all their HR needs. And the data that you need is not in one system. It's probably in more, because you need to think about education. You need some personal details. You need compensation details, benefits, bonus, overtime data, pay, obviously. So you need to put all of that together to understand what people make, because the EU is not looking at base salary. They're looking at total compensation or total reward. So you need to include all of it, which means digging into systems, making sure data definitions are the same, and being able to collect that and analyze what is going on. I think that's the most important thing. The funny thing is, you were mentioning a global organization. I just talked last week to a company with only 60 employees. And typically we would be thinking, well, 60 employees, probably no pay gap, because it's fairly easy to spot what is going on there. Actually, they ran a pay transparency program because they discovered that hiring was based on, like you just mentioned, negotiation. So who negotiates the best gets the highest salary, and they were going to do some mass hiring. They wanted to get rid of that. And so they decided that they needed to put in a pay transparency program. Which goes to show that even if you have like 100 or maybe 200 employees, and this applies to you too, this is doable.
Yeah, I think that's so true. There's so many different companies that, and we're seeing this too. What we're seeing across a lot of our companies who are already using software to kind of look at this stuff in an ongoing way and to dig into root cause and policies and figure out how to change their organization in a way that prevents these disparities from happening in the future, is that there's this momentum around, let's fix this stuff before we need to actually report it. And
Mm-hmm.
and I think that's a pretty common attitude amongst folks that have really dug in and understand that this goes well beyond base pay. And this isn't the same as what we've been hearing about in the UK, at least here in the United States, where folks aren't quite as familiar. So I'm curious to the challenges that you've seen. So what do you think some of the biggest challenges or obstacles to overcome will be for companies in complying with these new requirements?
So I think that you really need to think this through. because I know that sometimes companies they have job architectures, they have compensation strategies, they have salary bands. They've never really thought this through from, for instance, a cultural background perspective, or from an age perspective, for instance, tenures. And what you currently see, especially when I talk to young people for other future work initiatives, is they are looking for a workplace that is fair. And lots of recent social movements that have played out in the United States are playing out here in Europe as well. And so the social aspect of it, the fact that it needs to be fair, the fact that people want a workplace that is fair to everyone that works there, and they also want to see that, and almost you have to prove that it is like that, is something that is an important aspect of employee engagement. And all companies in Europe are trying to figure out, what do we need to do to get people in the door? Because we have lots of problems with labor shortages, I would say. And so this aspect should not be underestimated, I think.
And can you tie that together for me a little bit in terms of, do you think the EU Directive on Pay Transparency is going to heighten that sense from employees that they want their workplaces to be fair? Is it going to give them, for instance, here in the US with pay transparency legislation accelerating, it's really giving employees sort of a common thing and some data, as you spoke to earlier, to say that salary range that's similar to the job that I'm in, why am I low in range? It's sort of giving them this jumping off point to ask a bunch of questions that we're helping our customers address. And sort of we think about it in terms of pay explainability. It's going up. The requirements around a company being able to explain why they pay what they pay is going up. Do you think something similar will happen with the EU Directive on Pay Transparency, and that it's going to give employees even a bigger sense of fairness and how they want to work within an organization that looks at this stuff?
I think it's a directive, but on the other side, I also think it's a requirement from an employee perspective, because the interesting thing I find is when you talk to directors of companies about pay transparency, they're very reluctant. They're like, no, my company cannot handle that, and no, salaries are secret here. I always say, well, do you ever have lunch with employees also around annual performance time? Because I can tell you, salaries are not a secret here, not anywhere. People talk about their salaries. People talk about their raises. They do not do it in front of you. You probably do not know it. But the problem with that is that there is a level of dissatisfaction if people cannot explain for themselves how much someone else in their team makes compared to themselves. Then there's a level of dissatisfaction that you have no idea exists, but that you need to address, because these people are going to look elsewhere and see if they can earn more money, where in reality, they might earn just the right amount, but you haven't sat down with them and explained why they make less than someone else. And you also haven't told them how they can have bridged that gap, maybe by getting another certification or gaining some more experience or taking on a specific project. So there's uncertainty in companies around why do people make what they make, I think is more detrimental in the end than that it helps people. And from that perspective, the EU directive is sort of inviting companies to talk about their compensation strategies and to create a clear path for employees, because first of all, you have to disclose the starting salary when you publish vacancies or when you talk to candidates. And secondly, you will also have to show the path in their career growth. So when they are promoted, what does that mean for them in this specific role? So there is going to be a lot more transparency than just a report.
Yeah, and I think what I'm hearing you say, and in conversations we've had in the past and with our customers, because we have, across our customers, we're analyzing 7 million employee records. And I think even the most sophisticated companies are anxious about communications, because once you report via the EU directive, and tell me if I'm wrong, this is public and it will trigger
Yes.
communication issues. So I think what I'm hearing you say is, number one thing to do to prepare for this in this 3-year time frame, it's not really about waiting 3 years, it's about taking action now. It's data
Yeah.
collection, making sure your data collection is solid, making sure you're looking not just at gender but other elements of data collection. And I heard you say ethnicity, disability status is really important in Europe, and other things. We can talk about that in a second. And number two, can you fix things before you have to report? Because that way you avoid this mess of having to report something, making it public,
Mhm.
triggering more communication issues. If you can get ahead of it and get ahead of finding the root cause, figuring out what your policies and behaviors are, fixing those pay equity issues ahead of the reporting timeframe. What's kind of the third thing? I feel like we have two really solid actions for folks watching. Like, what else are we missing?
So the third one is cost, because if there is a gap and you have to bridge it, it will be costly. And that means that it's not only the annual increase that you're looking at. For a number of people in your company, you will have to do more. And of course, you cannot say to the others, well, this year there is no annual increase because I have to bridge the gap with the others. That doesn't work either, which means that unless you know what that gap is, you cannot really budget. And
Mhm.
you and I both know that this is a costly endeavor. This is not $100. This is usually, or €100. This is usually a lot more. This is money that you actually have to work into your budget. And if you can spread that out over the next 2 or 3 years until you actually have to report, then you're giving yourself some time to catch up instead of having to do it in one big expense. Companies typically just don't have that budget. So lots of work, there's time, and then there are the costs. And I think that, again, from an employee engagement perspective, if you do nothing right now, and then your first report shows a big miss, you will have a huge issue with employee engagement, simply because people know that it is announced, or it has been announced. You have 4 years, and then you don't do anything in those 4 years. That does not sound like a good people strategy.
Yeah, I agree. I think the proactive nature of this, and one other thing that you said really struck me, because we do a lot of work with our customers, and I know you do as well with your clients and folks that you work with. It really does take a narrative, because when you think about what the EU is doing, and it's across EU member states, and let's talk about that in a second, just how very similar to in the US, you've got nuanced differences between New York's pay transparency law, California SB 1162, you've got Washington State. They've all
Mhm.
got like different flavors of a similar idea, but there's some really important nuances to watch. And I think it's the same thing with the EU directive across member states. So we can talk about that in a second. You mentioned sort of this idea of making movement and promotions. There's a big element of that in some of these laws or directives.
Yep.
And so I think the narrative is really important, because one of the things that's interesting to watch in terms of how the US and linear regression is starting to make its way to Europe in terms of how we think about equal work for equal
Mhm.
pay for equal work. And then the median pay gap is starting to influence the US, and we're seeing many more activist shareholder proposals asking companies to disclose their median pay gap. So we're sort of seeing this cross country, this influence that's happening
Yeah.
across. And so I'm just curious about what is the importance of that narrative? Because again, if you're talking about pay disparities, that's quite easy to solve. You can remediate, you can pay people, you can get out of the woods quite easily. But this other issue of the median pay gap, promotions, movement, opportunity, that requires some thinking about, ahead of reporting. You've got to figure out as a company, what is your story? How are you treating your people? What are the opportunities for promotion? What are you doing to close that gap? So have you worked with folks on sort of taking a step back and saying, one of the other reasons you can't wait 3 years is because you have to think about crafting that narrative?
I think that the companies that actually the first movers are exactly doing what you just said. They are the ones that are thinking about what is our story, not only around career progression, but around pay equity along the way. What does that mean when you make a promotion? Do you get more salary? Do you maybe can elect different benefits, other benefits? What does that mean? How do we become more attractive? And how can we explain to people that yes, with promotion, you will get more, but you will get more, but it will still be fair towards everyone else. And so that narrative needs to fit your company. It isn't the same for everyone. I know a couple of companies that have said, look, this is our base pay. It's the same for everyone who works here. It does not matter where you live. It does not matter what your education is, what your tenure is. When you start working for us, this is what you get, which is also a narrative. It's a very direct narrative, but it is one. And so it is really important that it fits your purpose and the values that you have, and then the story that you share with employees. Because remember, one of the important things, I think, is that all of this must be explainable to people who then understand why some people earn a little bit more than others, and who also understand why that is still fair. Because equal pay for equal work does not mean that everyone earns the exact same amount. There are always factors that can explain why someone gets a little bit more than someone else. But as long as you have the story straight and the narrative is good, and your communication is accepted by managers and employees, then you're fine.
Yeah, that's exactly. Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's how we see our customers every day using our pay policy analytics, because it's diving into root cause about why a company pays what it pays. And so all of a sudden what emerges is the authentic story around your policies and behaviors. And a company may not like them, but it gives you everything you need from a data-driven perspective to go make the changes.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you, but the other thing from a company perspective is those analysis also show you who you reward and why. And the interesting thing that I found is that when companies start to look at the data, they suddenly realize that some of the rewards that they handed out were not actually for behaviors or skills that they intended that way. So it also forces companies to really think if the compensation strategy that they have in their minds and the pay policies that they have set are actually aligned with how they have rewarded people in the past. And I thought that was a very interesting discovery as well.
Absolutely. So I have a question just based on the folks that are watching right now, because we've got a bunch of folks in the US as well. So do you mind, can you opine for a moment for the US based attendees? How is the directive also a US issue? So say you report something in 3 European countries, your people in the US see it and it triggers questions in the US. Like, what are you seeing right now in terms of impact to folks in the United States?
I think it has an impact around the world, actually, because most European companies are cross-border, and a lot of them are cross-regional as well. So once you start to do this for your European population, especially if you're headquartered here in Europe, you inevitably end up in a conversation of, well, if you're doing this for Europe, are you not doing this for the other regions? How does this work for us? And do we participate as well? And I think from from my experience with European headquartered companies, I think most of them will just say, look, we're not going to do this region by region. This is it. We have this one job structures, we have a compensation package. And yes, of course, there will be adjustments based on location, because typically that is how companies work. But it will also become more transparent. And if colleagues work within the EU and outside of the EU, suddenly they know what people in their job grade make. And if they deliver the same results, the same output, then also there you have to have a conversation. So yes, especially if you are a cross-regional company, I think this will have a ripple effect. From an HR perspective, you cannot manage all these different compensation strategies, and you also have to ask yourself, is it fair to everyone? And considering that you have to disclose salaries and you have to report, this will be known everywhere.
Yeah, I think what I hear you saying is coordinate now on a global basis. This
Yeah,
is a global approach, and you've got to think about what you share in these various reports may well impact what you share in other places. So
absolutely.
I think that's a really important point that we sort of have to pause on, because we talked about data collection, we talked about fix things now, so get ahead
Mhm.
of this, understand your policies and behaviors. You talked about the remediation and dollar side. I think this is another thing, just think globally. So one of the things that we've been doing, and we're pulling you into this as one of our advisors, is we're convening our global customers to talk about these issues together. So whether it's CHROs or heads of comp, just getting them all together in a room under Chatham House rules to discuss peer to peer how they're thinking about
Mhm.
strategies and tactics to do this. So if folks are watching and they want in on that, you don't have to be a customer, just let us know, ping us, and we'll
Mhm.
pull you into that. But I think in those conversations, it's where you get the real juice and meat about how
Mhm.
companies are thinking about this, because it goes very quickly from a global strategy to tactics, because you have to get very, very tactical as you think about 27 countries, plus you've got the US, you've got all this transparency legislation happening. And it brings me to maybe the last question, because I know we have 3 minutes left, but I'm really interested to know, where do you think the EU goes after the directive? Should we be anticipating further changes for further compliance as we start to get closer to the dates in which these things go live? What do you think's coming next?
No, I think for now we're sort of, we know what we have to do. For the next 3 years, the individual countries must codify this into national legislation. And the directive is the minimum standard. So it might be that some countries are more strict on this than others, just like with the GDPR, where we all know that Germany has the most strict application of the GDPR. So there will be countries that are going to be a little bit more strict, companies and countries that are exactly on the directive. So I would say take the directive, read it. It is like 30 or 40 pages. It's very clear. It spells out what you need to do. And if you do that, then you have a pretty good handle on what is expected and what you need to do now. And most importantly, I would recommend you don't wait. Start today. At a minimum, read the directive and then start to think about what you need to do. Because even if you think that 2027 is 4 years away, I can tell you it's not a lot of time when you have to do all this work.
Yeah, I think the message comes through loud and clear. And I think the fact that you have been speaking with so many companies for so long, really ahead of the EU directive, in anticipation of the directive, that those next steps are so obvious to you. And I think the audience really appreciates hearing them with such clarity, just in terms of, you've got to get ahead of the reputational risk. You've got to start thinking about fixing the issues now, really deeply understanding your policies and behaviors, getting to that root cause, figuring out a strategy for
Mm-hmm.
data collection, having a global approach to coordination across all of these global pay reports, and how you're going to weave that into then a narrative. I mean, this is a huge body of work.
Yeah.
And I'm so appreciative of having you with us along the way to help guide us and our customers. And I'll just say again and offer it up. We've got a lot of conversations amongst companies happening. We're trying to become sort of a convener on this topic so that we can help folks get ahead of it and really start to see around corners. So again, if you're interested in that, please let us know. But just think about all the things that I think we've heard from Anita today. You've got, one, maybe two cycles to fix things. So that
Mhm.
means starting now. And I think that came through loud and clear. So really appreciate your time, your expertise, and just being here with us today to share. I think this is the first time on a LinkedIn Live I've been taking notes. I've been trying to interview you, and I keep laughing at myself that I'm trying to write down stuff you're saying
Mhm.
because this will be recorded. So if folks want it or want to share it, we'll have it for you soon. So again, thank you so much, Anita. Really
You're
appreciate
welcome.
the time.
Thank you.
Okay.